Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. Today we have a unique story narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it and watch till the end, guys.
There exists a special kind of horror reserved not for those who die too young, but for those who live far too long. In the grim darkness of the far future, where life is cheap and death comes swiftly to most, there are beings who cannot die. They stand eternal watch over humanity's corpse god emperor, golden sentinels whose existence stretches across millennia like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. These are the Adeptus Custodes, and their immortality is not a gift, but a curse that grows heavier with each passing century. Imagine existing for 10,000 years, not sleeping through those years in stasis or cryogenic suspension, but living them, every single day, every hour, every moment of those 100 centuries of consciousness, awareness, and memory. Your body never weakening, never truly aging beyond your physical prime. But your mind remembers it all. The Adeptus Custodes are not simply warriors who happen to live a long time. They are beings fundamentally transformed on a genetic and biological level to endure forever, or at least until violence finally claims them. And as we peel back the layers of their existence, we discover that this apparent blessing carries with it torments that would break lesser beings. The Custodian Guard stands as perhaps the most elite fighting force humanity has ever produced. Where Space Marines are mass-produced super soldiers created from gene seed templates, each Custodian is a unique work of art. They are to Space Marines what the Emperor is to his Primarchs, a comparison that speaks volumes about the gulf in capability between these golden warriors and their power-armored cousins. But their superiority is not limited to physical might or combat prowess. The Custodians possess something far more profound and far more terrible: the ability to live essentially forever. Each Custodian is crafted through a process so complex and demanding that it makes the creation of a Space Marine look almost crude by comparison. Where Astartes are implanted with gene seed organs over the course of years, Custodians undergo a complete genetic rewriting on a molecular level. This process begins in infancy, with candidates selected from Terra's nobility or, in darker times past, from the children of the Emperor's conquered enemies. The transformation takes decades, and the vast majority of candidates do not survive. Those who do emerge from this crucible are no longer entirely human in any conventional sense. The Emperor himself designed the Custodians, and it is said that his own genetic material flows through their veins like liquid gold. This is not metaphor or propaganda. The cellular alchemy that creates a Custodian incorporates elements of the master of mankind's own divine biology, binding these warriors to their creator on a level that transcends mere loyalty or programming. They are, in a very real sense, living fragments of the Emperor's will made manifest in physical form. And it is this connection, this fundamental reshaping of their very essence, that grants them their terrible immortality. Unlike Space Marines, who can theoretically die of old age after 1,000 years or so, Custodians do not age biologically. Their bodies reach physical maturity around 30 years of age and then simply stop the aging process. Their cells do not degrade, their organs do not fail, their bones do not weaken, and their muscles do not atrophy. A Custodian who is 100 years old is physically indistinguishable from one who is 10,000 years old. This biological perfection is maintained not through juvenate treatments or augmetic replacements, but through the fundamental nature of their enhanced physiology. They are functionally immortal, at least as far as the passage of time is concerned. This means that many of the Custodians currently standing guard over the Emperor's throne room have been doing so since the Horus heresy itself. They have stood vigil for 10,000 Terran years, an expanse of time so vast that it beggars human comprehension. When these ancient warriors were young, the Imperium was still in its infancy. The Emperor walked among his people. The The Primarchs led their legions across the stars. The galaxy was being brought into compliance, and the dream of human supremacy seemed achievable. These custodians remember that age. They remember what it felt like to believe in something bright and hopeful. And they have spent the following 10 millennia watching that dream rot into the nightmare that is the 41st millennium. But to truly understand what happens when a custodian lives too long, we must first understand what their immortality actually means on a practical level. This is not the simplistic immortality of fantasy stories, where characters live forever without consequence. This is biological immortality, married to psychological eternity, and the two do not always complement each other well. A custodian's body may not age, but their mind must somehow process and store 10,000 years of experience, memory, and trauma. The human brain, even one as enhanced as a custodian's, was not designed to hold 10 millennia of memories. Natural human memory works through a process of encoding, storage, and retrieval, but it also relies heavily on forgetting. We forget the vast majority of our experiences, because if we did not, our minds would become overwhelmed with useless information. But a custodian cannot afford the luxury of forgetting. Their enhanced minds retain information with perfect clarity. Every battle tactic they have ever learned, every threat assessment they have ever made, every moment they have stood in the Emperor's presence. Their memories do not fade into comfortable vagueness. They remain sharp, clear, and present. Imagine remembering, with perfect clarity, every single day you have lived for 10,000 years. The weight of that accumulated experience would be staggering. Every face you have ever seen, every word ever spoken in your presence, every death you have witnessed, every failure you have endured, all of it preserved in crystalline detail within your mind, accessible at any moment, impossible to forget or diminish through the mercy of time's passage. This is the reality for the eldest custodians, and it shapes them in ways that are both profound and terrible. The Custodian Guard are created to be more than just physically superior warriors. Their minds are programmed and fortified through means that remain unknown beyond the Emperor's own forbidden laboratories. They are filled with encyclopedic knowledge of every art of death, deceit, and destruction they might encounter in their duty. Their perception and apprehension of threat operates literally beyond natural human limits. They can assess a situation, identify dangers, and formulate responses faster than any unaugmented human could possibly manage. Their intellects are as honed and deadly as their physical forms. But this mental enhancement, this superhuman cognitive capacity, comes with its own unique torments when stretched across millennia. The custodians are not simple killing machines. They are scholars, artisans, philosophers, and counselors in addition to being warriors. They are expected to maintain their minds as carefully as they maintain their bodies, engaging in practices like yothagna, a form of meditative exercise that helps them process their thoughts and maintain mental equilibrium. But no amount of meditation can truly prepare a mind for the weight of 10,000 years. Consider what it means to perceive time differently when you have lived for so long. To a human who lives 80 years, a decade represents 1/8 of their entire existence. It is a significant portion of their life, heavy with meaning and change. But to a custodian who has lived for 10,000 years, a decade is 1,000th of their existence. It is a blink, a moment, barely worth noting in the grand scope of their experience. Years that would define a human life pass for a custodian like days. Centuries flow by like months. The perception of time itself transforms when you have so much of it. This temporal distortion affects how custodians relate to the world around them. Events that would seem momentous to mortals become almost trivial in the context of millennia. Political upheavals that reshape the Imperium are just another in an endless series of crises. Wars that consume billions of lives are merely the latest iteration of conflicts, that have repeated themselves countless times across the centuries. Even the deaths of individual humans, tragic as they might be, lose their emotional weight when you have witnessed millions of such deaths over the course of your existence. The custodians begin to see patterns where others see only chaos. They recognize the cyclical nature of human folly, the way the same mistakes repeat themselves across generations, centuries, and millennia. This perspective grants them wisdom, certainly, but it also distances them from the immediate human concerns that drive so much of the Imperium's daily functioning. How can you truly care about a trade dispute or a succession crisis when you have seen thousands of such disputes and crises rise and fall like tides? How can you invest emotional energy in outcomes that will be forgotten long before you die? Yet despite this growing detachment, the custodians carry with them a burden that never lightens with the passage of time. It is a psychological weight that has defined their existence for the past 10,000 years. A guilt so profound that it has literally reshaped their entire order. This is the scar upon the soul that marks every custodian, from the freshest inductee to the most ancient veteran, the knowledge that they failed in their most fundamental duty. The Horus heresy was the defining catastrophe of the custodian guard's existence. When the War Master Horus turned traitor and brought the full fury of chaos against the Imperium, the custodians stood ready to defend their emperor. They had been created for exactly this purpose, to protect the master of mankind from any threat regardless of its nature or origin. They were the emperor's Praetorian Guard, the ultimate defenders of humanity's sovereign. And when the moment of greatest crisis arrived, when Horus himself confronted the emperor aboard the traitor's flagship Vengeful Spirit, the custodians were there. But they were not enough. Despite their superhuman abilities, despite their perfect training and equipment, despite their absolute loyalty and willingness to die for their lord, they could not prevent the tragedy that unfolded. The emperor fought Horus in single combat, while custodians battled the War Master's forces throughout the ship. Constantine Valdor himself, the first and greatest of the custodian guard, led his warriors in a desperate attempt to reach the emperor's side. But they were scattered, separated, delayed by the machinations of chaos itself. And in that critical moment of separation, disaster struck. The emperor defeated Horus, but the victory came at an unthinkable cost. The War Master, empowered by the dark gods themselves, dealt the emperor a mortal wound before being destroyed. The master of mankind's body was shattered beyond any hope of recovery. Only his immense psychic power kept him alive as he was rushed back to Terra and interred within the Golden Throne, that ancient and mysterious device that would preserve his consciousness while his body became little more than a withered husk. For the Custodian Guard, this was not simply a military defeat or a tactical failure. It was the complete and utter collapse of everything they existed to prevent. They had been created for one purpose above all others, to keep the Emperor safe. And in that purpose, they had failed absolutely. The Emperor would never walk among his people again. He would never lead his armies or guide his Imperium directly. He would spend the rest of eternity trapped in a slowly failing machine, his psyche stretched across the Astronomicon, while his body decayed by infinitesimal degrees. And the Custodians had failed to prevent this fate. The psychological impact of this failure cannot be overstated. Imagine being created for a single overriding purpose, having that purpose coded into your very genetics, your every thought and action oriented around this one sacred duty, and then failing at it in the most catastrophic way possible. Now imagine living with that failure, not for years, not for decades, but for 10,000 years. Every day standing guard over the evidence of your failure. Every moment aware that your emperor sits broken on his throne because you were not good enough, fast enough, or strong enough to protect him. In the aftermath of the heresy, the Custodians adopted black cloaks as a symbol of their shame. Where once they had worn only their golden armor, Now they shrouded themselves in black fabric as a visible sign of mourning and failure. This was not a temporary gesture of grief. 10,000 years later, they still wear these cloaks. 10,000 years of mourning for a single moment of failure. 10,000 years of shame that never diminishes, never fades, never becomes easier to bear. For newer custodians, those created in the millennia after the heresy, this guilt is a learned burden. They are inducted into an order defined by its failure, taught from their earliest days that the greatest catastrophe in human history occurred on their watch. They carry the shame of something they did not personally experience, but must nonetheless bear as part of their identity. But for the ancient ones, the custodians who actually stood guard during the heresy, who actually witnessed the emperor's fall, the guilt is far more personal and far more terrible. These ancient warriors carry memories that newer custodians can only learn about from historical records. They remember the emperor as he was before, vital and commanding, a being of such overwhelming presence that to stand in his light was to understand what divinity might truly mean. They remember his voice, his manner, the way his attention felt when it turned upon you. They remember serving a living God who walked and spoke and led. And then they remember the moment that God fell, and they have spent the following 10,000 years contemplating their role in that fall. This is not the kind of guilt that time can heal. Human psychology relies on certain defense mechanisms to process trauma and guilt. We rationalize our failures, find ways to forgive ourselves, allow the passage of time to dull the sharp edges of our pain. But custodians cannot afford such luxuries. Their enhanced minds retain traumatic memories with the same perfect clarity as any other experience. The moment of failure is always present, always accessible, never softened by the mercy of forgetting. And their sense of duty is so fundamental to their nature that forgiveness, self-directed or otherwise, is simply not possible. The weight of this eternal shame shapes every aspect of custodian psychology and behavior. It drives their absolute dedication to duty, their refusal to leave terror for most of the post-heresy era, their obsessive focus on protecting the emperor's physical form. They cannot undo their failure, but they can at least ensure it never happens again. Even if that means standing vigil in the throne room for 10,000 years, watching over a corpse that was once their god, serving a duty that has been reduced to mere guard work when it once encompassed so much more. But guilt is not the only psychological burden that comes with extreme longevity. As the centuries and millennia accumulate, the custodians begin to experience changes in their perceptions, their emotions, and their connections to the world around them. These changes are subtle at first, barely noticeable even to the custodians themselves, but over time, they compound and intensify, transforming the very nature of what it means to be a custodian. One of the first changes that ancient custodians notice is a gradual emotional flattening. The intense feelings that characterized their earlier centuries begin to lose their edge. Joy becomes muted satisfaction, anger becomes cold calculation, fear, which never troubled them much to begin with, disappears almost entirely. This is not a deliberate choice or a trained response. It is simply the natural result of experiencing the same emotional patterns for thousands of years. When you have felt anger 10,000 times, when you have experienced satisfaction in victory millions of times, when you have known loss on countless occasions, the emotional impact of each new instance diminishes. This emotional dulling serves a protective function in some ways. Without it, a custodian might be driven mad by the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of experiences, each carrying its full emotional charge. The ability to feel less intensely allows them to function despite the crushing burden of their memories. But it also represents a loss of something fundamentally human. The capacity for deep emotional experience is part of what makes consciousness meaningful. As that capacity fades, the custodian becomes less of a person and more of a function, a role, a purpose incarnate. Constantine Valdor, the first Captain General of the Custodian Guard, was known for his stoic and observant personality. Outside observers claimed that he experienced no emotions such as pride or arrogance, or really any feeling at all besides his sense of duty to the Emperor. But this assessment, while perhaps true later in his existence, likely did not apply to the young Valdor. No one is created entirely without emotions. Rather, it seems that over the course of his service, across centuries and then millennia of existence, Valdor's emotional range narrowed and compressed until only duty remained as a driving force. This is what happens when a custodian lives too long. The vibrant complexity of emotional experience that makes life rich and meaningful slowly contracts into a narrow band of purposeful function. They do not stop caring entirely, but what they care about becomes increasingly abstract and removed from immediate human concerns. They care about the Emperor, about their duty, about the theoretical survival of humanity. But individual humans, specific events, the day-to-day concerns that fill the lives of mortals, these become increasingly difficult to invest with genuine emotional significance. The isolation that comes with this emotional flattening is profound. Other custodians might understand because they experience similar changes themselves, but even that understanding is limited. The custodians do not form the bonds of brotherhood that characterize Space Marine chapters. They are explicitly created to function as individual warriors, rather than as parts of a greater whole. When the Emperor once remarked that it was humanity's nature for brothers to fight brothers, a custodian responded that he would not know because he had no brothers. This individualistic nature means that even other custodians cannot truly share the burden of their emotional isolation. And yet, paradoxically, the custodians must continue to function within a galaxy full of beings who experience the full range of human emotions. They must interact with mortal servants, with space marines, with imperial officials and nobles. They must make decisions that affect billions of lives. They must serve as advisors and counselors to the Imperium's leadership. But they do all of this from behind an ever-thickening wall of emotional distance, looking at the passionate concerns of shorter-lived beings with something approaching incomprehension. How does a custodian who has lived for 5,000 years relate to a human administrator who is worried about a planet's tithes? The administrator experiences this concern with genuine anxiety, feeling the weight of responsibility and the fear of failure. But to the custodian, this is just another tithe dispute, identical in all meaningful ways to thousands of others he has witnessed. The outcome will be forgotten within decades. The people involved will be dead within a century. None of it matters in the grand scope of time. And yet, the custodian must pretend that it does matter, must engage with the concerns of these ephemeral beings as if their worries held genuine significance. This constant need to bridge the gap between their own timeless perspective and the urgent immediacy of mortal concerns creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that only intensifies over the centuries. The custodians become actors playing a role, performing concern and engagement, while feeling less and less of the genuine emotional connection that makes such concern meaningful. They say the right words, make the appropriate decisions, fulfill their advisory roles, but it all becomes increasingly mechanical as the millennia wear on. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of custodian longevity is that their bodies do not reflect the changes happening in their minds. A 10,000-year-old custodian looks identical to one who is only a few centuries old. Their golden armor gleams with the same brilliance. Their physical capabilities remain at peak performance. To outside observers, they appear unchanging and eternal, golden demigods who stand above the concerns of time itself. But inside, behind the perfect facade, the slow erosion of their humanity continues inexorably forward. This brings us to one of the most significant developments in the life of an ancient custodian, the moment when they begin to notice the physical decline that marks the beginning of the end of their active service. For all their biological immortality, for all their genetic perfection, The custodians are not entirely immune to the effects of time. They do not age in the traditional sense, but after several millennia, subtle changes begin to manifest. Changes that to any other being would be imperceptible, but to a custodian represent unacceptable degradation. The decline typically manifests first in reaction times. A custodian who has served for 3,000 or 4,000 years might notice that their response to a threat is slower by 1/10 of a second compared to their peak performance. To put this in perspective, 1/10 of a second is 100 milliseconds. For a normal human, this would be completely unnoticeable, well within the normal variation of reaction time. Even for a space marine, this would be considered negligible. But for a custodian, whose reflexes operate at levels beyond natural human limits, a delay of 100 milliseconds is a catastrophic failure.
You know, when I first started researching this topic, I thought the custodians had it made. Immortality, superhuman abilities, standing guard in the Imperium palace. Sounds pretty good, right? But the more I dug into the lore, the more I realized this might be the worst fate in the entire setting. Think about it. A guardsman dies in a trench after maybe 20 years of life. A space marine might serve for a few centuries before falling in battle. Both of these are tragic, sure, but at least they get an ending. The custodians, they're stuck watching the Imperium rot for 10,000 years with perfect memory of what it used to be. They can't forget, they can't leave, they can't die unless something kills them. That's not a reward for loyalty, that's a curse. It really makes you wonder if the Emperor understood what he was creating, or if even he couldn't predict what immortality would do to a conscious mind across that span of time.
This is because custodians hold themselves to standards that would be impossible for any other being to meet. They are not simply the best warriors in the Imperium. They are perfection incarnate, the absolute pinnacle of what the Emperor's genetic engineering could achieve. Their purpose is to counter any possible threat to the Emperor's person, which means they must be capable of responding to dangers that operate beyond the capabilities of normal humans. A delay of even a fraction of a second could mean the difference between deflecting an assassin's blade and allowing it to strike home. When a custodian notices this degradation in their performance, the psychological impact is devastating. They have defined themselves by their perfection for thousands of years. Their entire identity is built around being the ultimate guardian, the perfect defender. And now, for the first time since reaching full maturity, they are declining. The deterioration is minimal, barely measurable, but it is real and it is progressive. Their bodies are finally beginning to show the effects of millennia of service. The decline is not dramatic. It does not follow the pattern of human aging where capabilities steadily diminish until death. Rather, it is a subtle degradation of the absolute peak performance that characterizes a younger custodian. A 5,000-year-old custodian is still vastly superior to any space marine and infinitely beyond any unaugmented human. By any objective standard, they remain among the deadliest warriors in the galaxy. But they are no longer perfect. And for a custodian, anything less than perfection is failure. Beyond reaction times, other subtle changes might manifest in ancient custodians. Their ability to process multiple simultaneous threats might slow slightly. Their capacity to maintain peak performance for extended periods might decrease marginally. Their recovery from injuries, while still superhuman, might take fractionally longer than it once did. None of these changes would be visible to outside observers. The ancient custodian still moves with impossible speed and grace, still strikes with devastating power, still exhibits combat capabilities that seem almost supernatural. But they know the truth. This knowledge creates a profound crisis of purpose. The custodian has existed for thousands of years solely to protect the Emperor. Their entire being is oriented around this single sacred duty, and now they must confront the reality that they are no longer capable of fulfilling that duty at the absolute highest level. They are no longer the perfect guardian they once were. Every moment they continue to serve, they represent a potential weakness in the Emperor's defenses. This is unacceptable. The custodian culture has developed a solution to this problem, one that is both noble and heartbreaking. When a custodian judges themselves no longer fit for active duty, when they recognize that their declining capabilities might endanger the emperor they are sworn to protect, they make a choice. They surrender their armor and weapons to the Hall of Armaments, don a simple black robe, and leave Terra to become what is known as an Eye of the Emperor. This is not retirement in any conventional sense. The custodian is not being put out to pasture, not being allowed to rest after millennia of service. Rather, they are transforming their service into a new form, one better suited to their slightly diminished capabilities. As Eyes of the Emperor, these ancient custodians travel the galaxy in secret, watching for threats to Terra and the Imperium, building networks of informants and agents, gathering intelligence that can be sent back to the Captain General through hidden channels. The decision to become an Eye of the Emperor is entirely voluntary and self-directed. No superior orders a custodian to leave. No external assessment declares them unfit. The custodian themselves makes the determination that they can no longer serve at the level required for active guard duty. This might seem like a simple administrative process, but it represents something far more profound. It is the moment when a being who has existed for thousands of years admits that they are failing, that time has finally begun to claim them, that their perfection is crumbling. Imagine the psychological weight of that admission. For millennia, the custodian has been invincible, unchanging, eternal. They have watched the galaxy transform around them while remaining fixed and constant. And now, finally, they must acknowledge that they too are subject to the passage of time. They are not truly immortal. They are not immune to decline. They are, in however small a way, beginning to fail. For a being whose entire identity is built around never failing, this realization is shattering. The ritual of surrender is deliberately simple and unadorned. The custodian walks to the Hall of Armaments, a vast repository of weapons and armor accumulated over 10,000 years. They remove their golden armor piece by piece, placing each component in its designated location. They surrender their guardian spear or whatever weapon they have carried into battle for centuries or millennia. They strip away the physical symbols of their status as active guardians until they stand in simple robes, looking less like golden demigods and more like ordinary humans. But of course, they are not ordinary humans. They never have been and never will be. Beneath the black robe, they still possess the same enhanced physiology, the same supernatural strength and speed, the same cognitive capabilities that have defined them since their creation. The armor and weapons were never the source of their power. They were merely tools. The true weapon is the custodian themselves, and that weapon remains largely intact despite the marginal decline that prompted their departure. Once they have surrendered their war gear, the custodian simply leaves. There is no ceremony, no formal recognition of their service, no grand farewell. They slip away into the galaxy as quietly as shadows, their destination known only to themselves. Some work entirely alone, becoming solitary agents moving through the Imperium's shadows. Others build extensive networks of informants and operatives, using fear and intimidation to secure compliance where loyalty and honor will not suffice. All of them maintain their watch, searching for threats that could harm Terra or the Emperor, sending warnings back through secret channels when such threats are identified. The Eyes of the Emperor are perhaps the most tragic figures in the entire Imperium. They are warriors who have given everything to their duty, who have stood guard for thousands of years, who have sacrificed any possibility of a normal existence for the sake of protecting their God Emperor. And in the end, as their reward for this service, they are exiled from the only home they have ever known, sent out into a galaxy full of beings who could never understand what they have endured, condemned to continue serving a duty that can never truly be completed. They travel alone through the darkness between the stars, these ancient warriors wrapped in black robes, and they carry with them the weight of millennia. Every Eye of the Emperor has witnessed the fall of the dream they once served. They remember the Great Crusade. Remember the hope that humanity might truly unite and cleanse the galaxy. They remember the Emperor walking among his people, Remember Primarchs leading their legions. Remember a time when victory seemed possible. And now, they wander through the nightmare that replaced that dream, searching for threats in a galaxy that has become nothing but threats. The loneliness of this existence cannot be overstated. The Eye of the Emperor has no brothers, no companions, no one who shares their experience or understands their perspective. They interact with mortals whose entire lifespans are barely perceptible, flickers compared to their own vast existence. They might build networks of agents, but these agents are tools, not friends. The gap between a several thousand-year-old custodian and even the most exceptional human is simply too vast to bridge with genuine connection. Some Eyes of the Emperor eventually choose a different path. Rather than continuing their lonely vigil in the galaxy's darkness, they request to be interred within a venerable Contemptor dreadnought. This is a choice that trades one form of immortality for another. The Custodian's failing body is installed within a massive armored shell, their consciousness linked to the machine's systems. Their existence reduced to brief periods of awakening separated by long stretches of unconscious stasis. It is, in its own way, a kind of death, but it is a death that allows them to continue serving, to remain on Terra, to stand guard as they were always meant to do on. The psychological implications of choosing dreadnought interment are complex. On one hand, it represents an acceptance of limitation, an admission that the biological body can no longer maintain the standards required. On the other hand, it is a continuation of service, a way to remain useful despite the ravages of time. For a custodian, whose entire purpose is defined by service to the Emperor, this trade might seem worthwhile. Better to exist as a consciousness within a machine than to fade away entirely. But dreadnought interment comes with its own unique torments. The custodian is no longer truly living in any conventional sense. They experience periods of consciousness when awakened for battle or consultation, but between these activations, they exist in a state that is neither sleep nor death. Time loses all meaning in this state. The dreadnought might be awakened for a campaign and then return to stasis for decades or centuries. From the custodian's perspective, these gaps in consciousness are instantaneous. They close their eyes in one century and open them in another, and the world has changed in ways they can barely comprehend. The isolation of dreadnought existence exceeds even the loneliness of serving as an Eye of the Emperor. The custodian within the armored shell cannot feel physical sensations in the same way. They cannot move freely, cannot interact with the world except through the dreadnought's weapons and sensors. They are trapped within a prison of ceramite and adamantium, their existence reduced to brief moments of violent action, separated by vast expanses of nothing, and yet they endure. Because that is what custodians do, they endure. To truly understand what happens when a custodian lives too long, we must consider the example of Constantine Valdor, the first and perhaps greatest of all custodians. Valdor was already ancient by the time of the Horus heresy, having served the emperor since before the Unification Wars. He was the emperor's right hand, a warrior whose skill was said to rival even the Primarchs, a leader whose tactical genius shaped the early Imperium. And then, sometime after the heresy, he simply disappeared. The historical records regarding Valdor's disappearance are frustratingly vague. What we know is this. Sometime around the same period when Leman Russ vanished on his own mysterious quest, Constantine Valdor walked out of the imperial palace in the dead of night. He turned back once to look upon the palace, whispered the words, "Only in death," the first part of the famous imperial maxim, "Only in death does duty end," and then vanished into darkness. He took his armor and weapons with him, which were never returned to the Hall of Armaments. His fate is unknown, even to the custodian guard themselves. Think about what this disappearance represents. Constantine Valdor had existed for so long that precise records of his age do not exist. He was there at the beginning, during the darkest days of old Earth's history, when the Emperor first began his campaign to unite Terra. Valdor fought in the Unification Wars. He oversaw the creation of the Space Marine Legions. He witnessed the discovery of the Primarchs. He led the Custodian Guard through the Great Crusade. He was present at Prospero when Magnus the Red was brought to account. He fought in the Webway War against endless hordes of demons. He was there on the Vengeful Spirit when the Emperor confronted Horus. And he lived through the following millennia, watching the Imperium transform into something the Emperor would barely recognize. Valdor's original name, his full name earned through his service, consisted of 1,932 words by the time of the Horus heresy. By the 41st millennium, a book containing his complete name filled an entire volume. This speaks to the accumulation of deeds, honors, and achievements across an almost incomprehensible span of time. Each word in that name represented some aspect of his service, some battle fought, some threat countered, some victory achieved, and the name grew and grew until it became almost meaningless in its enormity. What happens to a mind that has existed for so long? What psychological changes occur across 10,000 years or more of continuous consciousness? Recent revelations suggest that Valdor may have become the mysterious figure known as the King in Yellow, a being who commands vast resources and operates at the head of secret networks that might predate the Imperium itself. If this is true, it tells us something profound about what ancient custodians become. The King in Yellow is described as commanding forces that include cloned Primarchs, armies of specialized warriors, and resources that span the galaxy. He operates from a fortress called the City of Dust, built directly in the warp itself. His goals remain mysterious, but many believe he is still working towards some purpose the Emperor set for him long ago. If this truly is Valdor, then he represents the ultimate evolution of a custodian who has lived too long. He is no longer simply a bodyguard. He has become something else entirely, a force that operates on a scale and with objectives that transcend his original purpose. But whether or not the King in Yellow is truly Valdor, the very fact of his disappearance tells us something important. Even the greatest of custodians, even the one who epitomized everything it meant to be part of the 10,000, eventually reached a point where he could no longer continue his service in its original form. Something called him away from Terra, whether it was a command from the Emperor, a psychological need to escape the weight of millennia, or some other purpose we cannot fathom. The nature of his departure, slipping away in darkness with only a cryptic phrase, suggests a being who had moved beyond conventional understanding. Valdor's disappearance also highlights a disturbing pattern. He is one of 3 captain generals who have vanished without the Adeptus Custodes being aware of the details. 3 of the greatest custodians in history, beings who led the entire order, simply walked away from their duty and were never seen again. This pattern suggests that something happens to custodians who live long enough and rise high enough in their hierarchy. They reach some threshold of experience or understanding that changes them fundamentally, that makes their continued service in conventional roles impossible. We might speculate about what Valdor experienced during his 10,000 years of life. He saw the Emperor at his most vital, witnessed the master of mankind's genius and power firsthand. He knew the Primarchs personally, fought alongside them, sometimes clashed with them. He witnessed humanity's greatest triumph during the Great Crusade and its greatest catastrophe during the Horus heresy. He stood watch as the Imperium slowly devolved from an enlightened realm into a tyrannical theocracy that worshipped the Emperor as a god, despite his explicit rejection of such worship. How does a mind process that kind of decline? How does a being who remembers what was supposed to be reconcile it with what actually came to pass? Valdor knew the Emperor's vision for humanity. He understood the imperial truth, the rejection of superstition and religion in favor of reason and science. And then he watched as that vision was systematically dismantled and replaced with the very dogma and ignorance the Emperor had sought to eliminate. He witnessed the birth of the imperial cult, watched it spread across the galaxy, saw the Emperor transformed from a man, albeit a transcendent one, into a deity worshipped by quadrillions. For a being who served the Emperor himself, who knew the truth behind the myths. This transformation must have been agonizing. Every prayer offered to the god emperor was a mockery of what he actually believed. Every ritual of the ecclesiarchy was a perversion of his vision. Every superstition that took root was a failure of the imperial truth. And the custodians could do nothing to stop it. They were too few in number, too focused on their primary duty of guarding the emperor's physical form. They watched the Imperium rot from within and were powerless to prevent it. This brings us to another aspect of what happens when a custodian lives too long: the accumulation of failures and disappointments. The Horus heresy represents the greatest failure, certainly, but it is far from the only one. Across 10,000 years, the Imperium has suffered countless catastrophes, rebellions, alien invasions, and losses. Worlds have fallen. Populations have been exterminated. The Great Crusade's gains have been rolled back or lost entirely. And through it all, the custodians have stood watch, unable to prevent the slow degradation of everything they were created to protect. The psychological toll of witnessing this decline while being unable to stop it is immense. Humans cope with such situations through various defense mechanisms. We rationalize, we find silver linings, we lower our expectations. We find meaning in small victories. But custodians, with their perfect memories and their inability to truly forget or move past trauma, cannot employ these coping mechanisms effectively. Every failure remains as fresh and painful as the day it occurred. Every loss is permanent and unforgivable. The weight of 10,000 years of accumulated disappointment would crush a lesser being. Yet the custodians endure. They stand their watch despite the crushing weight of their existence. They maintain their standards despite knowing that perfection is impossible. They serve despite having every reason to despair. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their nature, not their physical capabilities or their combat prowess, but their sheer stubborn refusal to give up, despite the psychological torture of their existence. But this endurance comes at a cost. The emotional flattening we discussed earlier intensifies over time. Ancient custodians become increasingly mechanical in their thinking, less driven by feeling and more by pure logic and duty. They process the world through frameworks of threat assessment and tactical response, rather than emotional engagement. They become, in essence, more like the machines they sometimes pilot than the humans they were created to protect. This transformation is visible in how ancient custodians interact with others. Where younger custodians might still display some emotional range, might show something approaching warmth or concern, or even humor in their dealings with others, the ancient ones become cold and distant. They speak in clipped, formal tones. They express no opinions beyond tactical assessments. They maintain perfect decorum, but no genuine engagement. They are present in the conversation but not truly participating in it. They have become hollow, their personalities eroded by the passage of millennia until only the core of duty remains. The relationship between ancient custodians and the rest of humanity becomes increasingly strange and alienated as the centuries pile up. Consider what it means to exist among beings whose entire lifespans are barely perceptible compared to your own vast experience. A human who lives 80 years exists for less than 1% of the time a 10,000-year-old custodian has been alive. From the custodian's perspective, humans flicker in and out of existence like mayflies, each generation barely distinguishable from the last. This creates a profound disconnect in how custodians perceive human concerns. When a mortal administrator comes to a custodian with some urgent problem, the custodian knows with perfect certainty that this problem will be forgotten within a century at most. The people involved will die. Their descendants will have other concerns. The urgent crisis of today will be ancient history tomorrow. Why invest emotional energy in something so temporary? Why care deeply about outcomes that are, in the grand scope of time, utterly insignificant? And yet, the custodians must care because these ephemeral humans are what they exist to protect. The Emperor's vision was for humanity's benefit, and humanity consists of these fleeting individual lives. Each human that a custodian dismisses as insignificant is a human the Emperor wanted to protect and elevate. The contradiction is inescapable. The custodians must somehow maintain their commitment to protecting humanity while finding it increasingly difficult to relate to humans as individuals worthy of concern. This alienation extends even to space marines, who themselves live for centuries and possess enhanced perspectives that put them above normal human concerns. A Space Marine chapter might have veterans who are 500 years old, warriors who have served for half a millennium and seen things that would break mortal minds. These veterans are revered within their chapters as fonts of wisdom and experience. But to a 5,000-year-old custodian, a 500-year-old Space Marine is barely out of childhood. The gap in experience and perspective is simply too vast to bridge. Space Marines, despite their enhancements, still maintain some connection to humanity. They form bonds of brotherhood with their battle brothers. They take pride in their chapter's achievements. They feel loyalty to their homeworlds and concern for the humans they protect. They experience emotions in ways that, while perhaps more muted than unenhanced humans, are still recognizably human. But ancient custodians have moved beyond this. They no longer form true bonds. They no longer feel pride in the conventional sense. Their emotions have been worn away by time until almost nothing remains. The irony is profound. The custodians were created to be the ultimate protectors of humanity, but in becoming immortal guardians capable of serving for millennia, they have also become increasingly inhuman. They exist in a state of permanent alienation, unable to truly connect with the beings they protect, unable to share in the concerns and joys that make life meaningful for those beings, unable to die and escape the burden of their existence. They are trapped in a role they can never leave, serving a duty that can never be completed, enduring a life that stretches toward infinity with no hope of release. The few custodians who remain from the heresy era, who have stood watch for the full 10,000 years, represent the ultimate expression of what happens when a custodian lives too long. These ancient beings have existed for so long that they have become almost mythical even to other custodians. They are the last living connections to the Imperium's founding, the only warriors still in service who remember the Emperor as he was, who fought in the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade, who witnessed the birth of the Imperium and its subsequent degradation. But they are also, in a very real sense, no longer the beings they once were. 10,000 years of accumulated experience, memory, and trauma has fundamentally transformed them. The young custodians they were during the Unification Wars would barely recognize what they have become. Every aspect of their personality has been worn down, eroded away by the relentless passage of time until only the absolute core remains. They are duty incarnate, purpose made manifest, but they are no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. These eldest custodians move through the world like ghosts, present but not participating, observing but not engaging. They fulfill their assigned roles with perfect precision, but there is no passion behind their actions, no genuine investment in outcomes. They have seen the same patterns repeat themselves so many times that nothing truly surprises them anymore. They have witnessed every possible human folly, every variation of ambition and betrayal, every flavor of incompetence and malice. Nothing is new, nothing is interesting, nothing matters beyond the basic calculus of threat and duty. One particularly disturbing aspect of extreme custodian longevity is what happens to their sense of identity. As we discussed, each custodian accumulates names and titles over the course of their service. These names are meant to honor their achievements and preserve their deeds for future generations. But when those names grow to fill entire volumes, when a custodian has earned so many honors that their full title takes hours to recite, does the name still have meaning? Does it still represent an individual identity? or has it become just another burden to carry? The process of psychological erosion that affects ancient custodians resembles, in some ways, what happens to individuals with extreme age, even in our own world. Studies of centenarians and supercentenarians sometimes reveal that personality traits become more extreme and simplified over time. The complex, multifaceted individual of youth gives way to a simpler, more focused version in extreme age. But for humans, this process takes place over a century at most. For custodians, it extends across millennia. And the endpoint is not death, but continuation in this simplified state indefinitely. Imagine your personality being compressed and simplified over the course of 10,000 years. All the complexity, the contradictions, the nuances that make you who you are slowly filed away until only the most fundamental aspects remain. For a custodian, that fundamental aspect is duty to the emperor. Everything else, every interest, every preference, every aspect of personality that does not directly serve that duty gets gradually eroded away by the passage of time. What remains is a being so focused, so singular in purpose, that they have essentially become a function rather than a person. This is the ultimate fate that awaits all custodians who live long enough. They do not die in the sense of their bodies failing or their consciousness ending. Instead, they undergo a kind of psychological death, a gradual extinction of the self until only the role remains. They become what they were designed to be in the most literal and terrible sense, tools for the emperor's protection, weapons with just enough consciousness to wield themselves effectively, but no true inner life beyond the execution of their purpose. The emperor communicates with the custodians through dreams and visions, a fact that shapes their existence in profound ways. These communications are not the clear, direct commands that the emperor once gave when he walked among his people. Instead, they are fragmented, symbolic, open to interpretation. A custodian might receive a dream that shows them glimpses of possible futures, hints about threats to terror, suggestions about actions they should take. But the meaning is never entirely clear. The dream must be interpreted, analyzed, discussed with other custodians to reach some consensus about its significance. For younger custodians, these dreams provide a sense of continuing connection to the emperor, proof that he still watches over them despite his confinement to the Golden Throne. But for ancient custodians who have received thousands of such dreams across the millennia, the experience becomes more complicated. They have learned to recognize the patterns in the emperor's communications, to distinguish between dreams that carry genuine prophetic weight and those that are merely reflections of the dreamer's own concerns. They have developed a kind of cynicism about the process, not in the sense of doubting the emperor's power, but in the sense of understanding the limitations of this form of communication. Moreover, the content of these dreams can be deeply disturbing for custodians who remember the emperor as he was. The being who sends these fractured visions is not the same as the vital, commanding presence they once served. The emperor on the Golden Throne is diminished, fragmented, spreading his consciousness across the Astronomicon while trying to hold shut the webway breach, while simultaneously battling chaos in the warp, while still maintaining some connection to the physical world. The dreams that reach the custodians come from this shattered, divided entity, and they carry with them a sense of the emperor's torment. Ancient custodians must reconcile their memories of the emperor's former glory with the reality of his current state. They remember a being of such overwhelming power and presence that to stand in his light was to understand what true greatness meant. They remember his voice, clear and commanding, issuing orders that shape the fate of the galaxy. They remember his physical presence, striding through the imperial palace, leading armies, crafting the Primarchs. And now they receive broken dreams from a desiccated corpse trapped in a failing machine. The psychological impact of witnessing this degradation while being unable to prevent or reverse it adds another layer of torment to the custodian existence. They are watching their god die by infinitesimal degrees, the process stretched across 10,000 years and likely to continue for 10,000 more. Every dream they receive is evidence of the Emperor's ongoing suffering. Every fragmented vision is proof that the being they were created to protect endures a fate worse than death, and they can do nothing about it except continue standing watch, maintaining their vigil over a tragedy that can never be undone. This brings us to perhaps the most fundamental question about custodian longevity. What is the point? Why continue existing when existence has become an endless cycle of duty without joy, service without hope, consciousness without purpose, beyond the mechanical execution of assigned roles? Why endure the psychological torture of millennia for a cause that seems increasingly hopeless? The Imperium is not improving. The Emperor is not healing. The galaxy is not becoming safer. Every indication suggests that things will only get worse. So why keep going? The answer lies in the fundamental nature of what a custodian is. They were not created to be happy or fulfilled. They were not designed to have rich inner lives or complex emotional experiences. They were made to serve, and that purpose was coded into them at such a fundamental level that they literally cannot choose otherwise. A custodian who has lived for 10,000 years and endured psychological torments that would shatter any normal mind continues serving not because they choose to, but because they cannot conceive of doing anything else. This lack of true choice raises disturbing philosophical questions. Are the custodians actually individuals with free will, or are they biological automatons programmed to fulfill a function? If they cannot choose to abandon their duty, even when that duty has become an unending source of suffering, do they actually have agency? The line between an individual who chooses their purpose and a tool designed for a specific function becomes increasingly blurred when we consider beings who have been so fundamentally shaped by their creation that alternative choices become literally unthinkable. The tragedy of the Custodian Guard is that they were created to be incorruptible, absolutely loyal, incapable of failure in their duty, and they succeeded. But the cost of that success was the elimination of almost everything that makes consciousness valuable. They cannot experience true joy, because joy is not necessary for their function. They cannot form deep connections because such connections might compromise their duty. They cannot choose to leave or refuse orders because such choices would represent failure. They are trapped in their own perfection, unable to deviate from their purpose, even when that purpose has become a prison. As we approach the conclusion of our examination of what happens when a custodian lives too long, we must confront the bleakest aspect of their existence. There is no end in sight. The Imperium shows no signs of solving its fundamental problems. The Emperor remains trapped on the Golden Throne, with no prospect of healing or release. The forces of chaos continue to press against humanity from all sides. The galaxy offers no hope of peace or resolution. The custodians will continue standing watch for another 10,000 years, and then another, and then another, until either the Imperium falls entirely or something fundamental changes in the nature of their existence. For the eldest custodians, the ones who have already endured 10 millennia of service, the prospect of enduring another 10 millennia is almost incomprehensible. They have already been worn down to the core of their being. What will happen when another 10,000 years have passed? Will there be anything left of their original consciousness, or will they have become entirely mechanical in their function? Biological machines, executing programmed responses with no genuine awareness behind their actions. Perhaps this is what eventually drives some custodians to disappear, as Valdor did. Perhaps there is a threshold of endurance beyond which even the most perfectly crafted warrior cannot continue. Perhaps the mind, despite all its enhancements and conditioning, has absolute limits to how much experience and trauma it can process before it must either transform into something entirely different or cease functioning altogether. Valdor's disappearance might represent not abandonment of duty, but transcendence beyond it. an evolution into something that the Emperor intended all along, but which cannot be explained or understood by those still bound to conventional service. The other custodians who have vanished might have undergone similar transformations. 3 captain generals disappearing without explanation suggests a pattern, a developmental stage that occurs in custodians who live long enough and serve faithfully enough. Perhaps this is the Emperor's true plan for his custodians, not that they should stand guard forever, but that they should eventually evolve beyond their original purpose into beings capable of serving him in ways that transcend conventional understanding. Or perhaps the disappearances represent something darker, psychological breaks that even custodian conditioning cannot prevent when enough time has passed. Perhaps these ancient warriors simply reached a point where they could no longer endure the weight of their existence and wandered into the galaxy seeking either purpose or oblivion. The fact that even the custodian guard itself does not know what happened to these missing captain generals suggests that whatever fate befell them was either too terrible to speak of or too strange to comprehend. What we can say with certainty is that living as a custodian for thousands of years fundamentally transforms the being who experiences that lifespan. The process is not simply aging or gaining experience. It is a progressive erosion of everything that makes consciousness rich and meaningful until only duty remains. The custodian becomes less human and more function over time, their personality compressed into a narrow band of purposeful activity, their emotions muted until they barely register, their connections to others severed by the sheer weight of temporal distance. This transformation serves a purpose, of course. A custodian who could still feel the full weight of 10,000 years of accumulated trauma would be crippled by it, unable to function, broken beyond any hope of repair. The emotional flattening, the loss of connection, the reduction of personality to pure function, these are all defense mechanisms that allow the custodian to continue serving despite experiencing things that should drive them mad. But the fact that these changes serve a purpose does not make them any less tragic. The custodians represent humanity's attempt to create perfect guardians, warriors who could protect the Emperor across any span of time against any possible threat. And in a sense, they succeeded. The custodians have stood watch for 10,000 years and will continue standing watch for as long as the Imperium endures. But the price of that success was the creation of beings condemned to suffer in ways that normal humans cannot even comprehend, trapped in existence that grinds away their personalities across millennia, unable to die, unable to leave, unable to do anything except continue serving a duty that can never truly be completed. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Adeptus Custodes stand as perhaps the most tragic figures of all. They are not tragic because they die young or fail in their purpose. They are tragic precisely because they succeed too well, enduring too long, serving too faithfully. They become victims of their own perfection, prisoners of their own immortality. And they will continue standing watch, these golden ghosts in the Emperor's halls, until either the Imperium falls or the heat death of the universe claims everything. Because that is what they were made to do. Because they cannot choose otherwise. Because in the end, that is all they are. Duty incarnate, purpose made flesh. Consciousness reduced to function and function alone. The cost of immortality, it turns out, is mortality of a different kind. Not the mortality of the body, but the mortality of the self. A custodian who lives 10,000 years may have a body identical to one who has lived for only a century, but the being inhabiting that body is fundamentally different. The person they were has died 1,000 small deaths across the millennia, worn away by time until only the guardian remains. And that guardian will continue watching, continue serving, continue existing in a state that cannot properly be called life, but also cannot be called death, for as long as the Emperor endures. This is what happens when a custodian lives too long. They become eternal, they become perfect, they become less than human in every way that actually matters. And they keep standing watch, because that is all they can do, all they were made to do, all they will ever do until the stars themselves burn out and the universe grows cold. But we have not yet fully explored all the dimensions of this curse. There are other aspects of extreme custodian longevity that deserve examination, facets of their existence that reveal even more clearly the price they pay for their immortality. Consider the physical reality of existing for 10,000 years. Not the biological immortality we have discussed, but the simple fact of occupying physical space, of moving through the world, of existing as a body for that span of time. A custodian who has stood watch for 10 millennia has taken billions of steps. They have drawn billions of breaths, though they need far less oxygen than normal humans. They have blinked their eyes trillions of times. They have felt the weight of their armor pressing against their body for so many hours that the sensation has become indistinguishable from their natural state. The sheer repetition of physical existence becomes its own form of torment. Humans are saved from this by the limited span of their lives and by the fact that our bodies change constantly. We are literally different physical beings every 7 years as our cells replace themselves. But a custodian's enhanced physiology maintains consistency. The body that stood watch 10,000 years ago is essentially the same body standing watch today. The same nerves firing, the same muscles contracting, the same sensory input processed in the same ways. The monotony of physical existence extends across centuries until the custodian becomes almost numb to physical sensation itself. This physical numbness compounds the emotional flattening we discussed earlier. When you have felt the weight of your guardian spear in your hands 1 billion times, the sensation ceases to register as anything meaningful. When you have stood in the same positions, walked the same corridors, performed the same movements for millennia, the physical world becomes background noise. The custodian moves through space like a ghost, their body performing actions with perfect precision, while their consciousness barely registers the physical reality of those actions. There is also the question of what happens to a custodian's relationship with death across such vast spans of time. Humans, even enhanced humans like space marines, maintain some awareness that death will eventually claim them. This awareness shapes how they approach existence, lending urgency and meaning to their actions. But custodians, who cannot die from aging and who are skilled enough that death in combat becomes increasingly unlikely as they accumulate experience, must somehow maintain purpose without the prospect of ending. Death becomes theoretical for ancient custodians. They have seen countless others die, humans and space marines, and even other custodians. They understand death as a concept, can analyze it tactically and philosophically, but they do not fear it in any meaningful sense because they have existed so long that mortality seems to have no claim on them. This creates a strange psychological distance from one of the fundamental aspects of conscious existence. Death shapes life by providing boundaries and endpoints. But what happens to consciousness when those boundaries disappear into an infinite future? Some ancient custodians develop what might be called a death wish, though it manifests in subtle ways. They do not actively seek destruction, which would represent a failure of duty, but they cease taking the most extreme precautions. They accept assignments that carry higher risk. They position themselves slightly more aggressively in combat situations, not enough to constitute dereliction of duty, but enough that the odds of their eventual death increase marginally. It is as though, after millennia of existence, they are quietly hoping that fate will eventually grant them the release they cannot choose for themselves. Others go in the opposite direction, becoming so obsessed with survival that they develop elaborate protocols to minimize any possible risk of death. They have existed for so long that the thought of ending becomes terrifying, precisely because it represents the loss of all that accumulated experience and memory. These custodians will have catalogued every threat they have ever encountered, every tactic that has ever proven effective, every mistake that has ever led to a custodian's death. They carry this knowledge like armor, using it to ensure their own continuation, even as that continuation becomes increasingly burdensome. The relationship between ancient custodians and newer inductees into the Adeptus Custodes presents another fascinating dimension of what happens across extreme lifespans. When a custodian who fought in the Horus Heresy encounters one who was created in M40, the gap in experience is almost incomprehensible. The ancient custodian has 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom, tactical knowledge, and understanding of threats. The newer custodian, even if they have served for several centuries, is effectively a novice by comparison. This creates a hierarchy based not on rank, but on age and experience. The ancient ones are deferred to almost automatically, their judgments given weight that newer custodians cannot hope to match. But this deference comes with a price. The ancient custodians become isolated at the peak of their hierarchy, surrounded by those who revere them but cannot truly understand them. The gap in experience becomes a gap in relatability. How can a custodian who has served for 300 years truly comprehend what it means to have served for 10,000? The very framework of understanding is absent. Moreover, the ancient custodians watch as newer inductees arrive, serve, and sometimes fall in battle over the course of what seems to them like brief intervals. From their perspective, the turnover of personnel happens at an accelerating rate. Years that would have seemed significant in their youth pass in what feels like weeks. They find themselves greeting new custodians, learning their names, assigning them duties, and then turning around to find those same custodians have been killed in action or have chosen to become eyes of the Emperor. The continuity of personnel that defines military organizations becomes almost meaningless when you have outlived generations of your supposed peers. This brings us to the question of what terror itself means to a custodian who has watched it change across 10,000 years. The Imperial Palace is vast beyond normal comprehension, a structure that covers most of the ancient planet's surface. But even something as massive as the palace changes over millennia. New sections are added. Old sections are sealed off or repurposed. The decoration changes as different aesthetics come into and fall out of favor. The mortal servants who maintain the palace turn over generation after generation until a custodian can watch entire family lines rise from humble beginnings to positions of trust and then fade back into obscurity. Terror itself, what little remains of it beyond the palace's boundaries, undergoes transformations that would be imperceptible across a human lifetime, but become obvious across centuries. The planet's environment continues to degrade. The few remaining areas that are not covered by the palace's structures become increasingly polluted and corrupted. The population, already incomprehensibly vast, continues to grow and compress until terror becomes even more of a dystopian hive than it was at the Imperium's founding. An ancient custodian remembers what terror was like during the Unification Wars, when there were still open skies visible in some regions, when you could still find places where the planet's original surface was accessible. They remember the Emperor's campaigns to unite the warlords and techno-barbarians, the promise that terror would become the shining heart of a new galactic empire. And now they look upon a planet that has become a monument to decay and desperation, where quadrillions live in conditions that would have been considered intolerable in earlier ages, where the very air is toxic, and the water must be heavily processed to be even marginally safe. The psychological impact of watching your homeworld decay across millennia, while being unable to stop or reverse that decay, adds another layer to the custodian's burden. They are the guardians of humanity, but they can do nothing to address humanity's fundamental problems. They can protect the Emperor's physical form, but they cannot implement the Emperor's vision for human improvement. They can stand watch while everything they were created to protect slowly rots away. There is also the matter of how ancient custodians process technological and cultural changes across 10,000 years. The Imperium of M31 was a very different place from the Imperium of M41. Technology has regressed in many areas, advanced in a few others, and transformed in its relationship to human society. The secular rationalism that characterized the Great Crusade has been completely replaced by religious fanaticism. The organizational structures that once governed the Imperium have been replaced by bureaucracies so vast and complex that they function almost independent of any human direction. A custodian who remembers the early Imperium must somehow reconcile their memories with present reality. They recall when the imperial truth was official policy, when religion was actively suppressed, when the emperor rejected any form of worship. And now, they stand guard while that same emperor is worshipped as a god by virtually every human in the galaxy. The contradiction is absolute, and there is no way to resolve it. The custodians know the truth, but the truth has become irrelevant. The Imperium functions on lies and superstition now, and the custodians are powerless to change this reality. This cognitive dissonance extends to virtually every aspect of the Imperium's current functioning. The ancient custodians remember when the Adeptus Astartes were united as legions, when primarchs led their sons into battle, when the Imperium expanded rather than merely enduring. They remember when the Mechanicum was a partner rather than a mysterious cult, jealously guarding its secrets. They remember when the Administratum was a functional bureaucracy rather than a sprawling nightmare of inefficiency and corruption. They remember when things worked, when the Imperium represented hope rather than mere survival. And they must live with the knowledge that they watched all of this decay happen and could do nothing to stop it. They had the perspective to see where things were going wrong, the historical knowledge to recognize patterns of decline, but they lacked the authority or the numbers to intervene effectively. The Custodian Guard answers only to the Emperor, and the Emperor has been silent, except for cryptic dreams, for 10,000 years. So the Custodians stood watch, while the Imperium transformed into a parody of what it was meant to be. Another aspect of extreme Custodian longevity that deserves examination is the relationship between memory and identity. We have discussed how perfect memory becomes a burden when extended across millennia, but there is a deeper question here about what happens to the self when you can remember everything but can no longer distinguish which memories define who you are. A human's sense of identity is constructed largely from selected memories. We remember certain formative experiences, certain key relationships, certain moments that shaped who we became. But we forget the vast majority of our experiences, and this selective forgetting is essential to maintaining a coherent sense of self. We are not the sum of every moment we have experienced. We are the sum of the moments we remember and the meaning we assign to those memories. But what happens when you remember everything, when 10,000 years of experience are all equally accessible, all equally vivid in your mind? How do you construct a coherent identity from that overwhelming mass of memory? Which experiences actually define you when you have experienced so much that no single event, no matter how significant, can possibly stand out from the background noise of millennia? Ancient custodians face a crisis of identity that stems directly from this overabundance of memory. They can remember their creation, their training, their first battles. But these memories, no matter how formative they might have been buried under 10,000 years of subsequent experiences. The being who underwent those formative experiences is so far in the past, so separated from the present by vast gulfs of accumulated experience, that it is questionable whether they can be said to be the same individual at all. Philosophers have long debated the question of personal identity across time. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago, 20, 40? The question becomes infinitely more complex when we extend it across 10,000 years. A custodian who has existed that long has changed so fundamentally, has accumulated so much experience and undergone such profound psychological transformations that the connection to their original self becomes almost metaphysical rather than practical. Some ancient custodians respond to this crisis by constructing artificial frameworks of identity. They define themselves entirely through their duty, reducing their sense of self to their function as guardians. This simplifies the problem by eliminating the need to maintain a complex personal identity. They are custodians, and that is all they need to be. Their memories serve tactical purposes, informing their responses to threats, but they do not construct a narrative of selfhood from those memories. Others attempt to maintain continuity by fixating on specific aspects of their experience. They might define themselves through their relationship to the Emperor, making that single connection the thread that runs through all 10,000 years of their existence. Or they might define themselves through specific achievements, battles they fought, or threats they countered that seem significant enough to anchor their identity. But these attempts to maintain continuity across millennia often feel hollow, artificial constructs built to solve a problem that may not actually have a solution. The question of language and communication also becomes increasingly complex for ancient custodians. The Gothic spoken in M31 differs significantly from the Gothic of M41. New words have entered the language. Old words have changed meaning. Entire dialects and variations have emerged and faded. An ancient custodian must somehow maintain linguistic flexibility across this 10,000-year span, learning new forms of expression while maintaining the ability to understand older texts and communications. But more than just the mechanics of language, there is the question of how concepts themselves change across such vast time spans. Words that meant one thing during the Great Crusade might carry entirely different connotations in the 41st millennium. Ideas that were central to imperial philosophy in one era become heretical or forgotten in another. The ancient custodian must navigate these shifting meanings while maintaining their own understanding of what the original concepts were supposed to represent. This creates yet another form of isolation. When an ancient custodian speaks, they are using words that carry different meanings for them than they do for their listeners. When they hear others speak, they must constantly translate not just the words, but the concepts behind those words into frameworks that make sense given their vastly different historical context. Communication becomes an exercise in translation and interpretation rather than straightforward exchange of meaning. The relationship between ancient custodians and the concept of hope presents another fascinating psychological dimension. Hope requires the belief that the future might be better than the present, that positive change is possible, that effort toward improvement might bear fruit. But what happens to hope when you have lived for 10,000 years and watched the general trajectory of events move consistently in negative directions? The Imperium is not improving. Every objective measure suggests it is in terminal decline. The technological regression continues. The political fragmentation intensifies. The threats from chaos, xenos, and internal corruption grow more severe with each passing century. An ancient custodian has watched this decline play out across millennia. They have seen thousands of moments where it seemed like things might improve, where some reform or campaign or leader promised to reverse the decay. And they have watched every single one of those promises fail. How do you maintain hope when you have 10,000 years of evidence that hope is unjustified? How do you continue believing in positive outcomes when your entire existence is a testament to the inexorable nature of decline? Some ancient custodians abandon hope entirely, though they would never articulate it in those terms. They continue serving not because they believe their service will lead to improvement, but because service is all they know. They are trapped in a ritual of duty that has lost any connection to hopeful purpose. Others maintain a kind of grim determination that might look like hope from the outside, but is actually something quite different. They do not believe the Imperium will improve, but they continue serving because the alternative is unthinkable. Better to delay the final collapse for another century, another millennium, than to give up and allow it to happen sooner. Their service is motivated not by hope for the future, but by commitment to preventing the worst possible outcomes from arriving too quickly. A small number of ancient custodians maintain something approaching genuine hope, but it is hope of a very specific and narrow kind. They hope that the Emperor has a plan, that his apparent silence and incapacitation are part of some larger strategy that will eventually be revealed. They hope that their suffering and the Imperium's decline serve some purpose in a pattern too vast for even them to perceive. This hope requires faith that borders on the religious, which is ironic given that the custodians know the Emperor rejected religion. But after 10,000 years of watching everything decay, faith in an unseen plan might be the only form of hope available. The physical geography of the imperial palace takes on special significance for ancient custodians because it represents one of the few constants in their existence. While everything else changes, while people and cultures and technologies rise and fall, the palace itself endures. Ancient custodians know its passages and chambers with an intimacy that newer guards cannot match. They have walked every corridor, stood watch in every hall, memorized every sightline and defensive position. But this intimate knowledge comes with its own burden. The palace is not just a structure to these ancient warriors. It is a monument to their entire existence, a physical embodiment of the duty that has consumed their lives. Every chamber holds memories of past watches, past threats, past failures and successes. A custodian who has stood watch for 10,000 years cannot walk through the palace without being assaulted by memories at every turn. The throne room where they failed to protect the Emperor, the halls where they fought demons during the Webway War, the chambers where they received news of the latest catastrophe to befall the Imperium. The palace becomes a kind of memory palace in the most literal sense, each location serving as a trigger for recollections that span millennia. This can be useful for tactical purposes, allowing the ancient custodian to draw on vast reservoirs of experience when assessing threats. But it also means they can never escape their past. There is nowhere in the palace they can go to find respite from memory. Every space is haunted by everything that has happened there across 10,000 years. Consider also what it means for a custodian to witness the evolution of human civilization, not just on Terra, but across the galaxy. During the Great Crusade, ancient custodians might have traveled to newly compliant worlds, seen the diverse variations of human culture that had developed during Old Night. They witnessed the Emperor's attempts to unite all of humanity under a single banner, to preserve what was valuable in each culture while eliminating the dangerous and primitive elements. And then they watched as that project failed. As the Imperium ossified into rigid orthodoxy, as local variations were suppressed in favor of uniformity, as the rich diversity of human culture was crushed beneath the weight of imperial dogma, the ancient custodians remember what was lost, can recall specific worlds and cultures that no longer exist in any recognizable form. They carry within their memories the ghosts of human civilizations that have been erased from history. This creates a particular kind of grief that accumulates across the millennia. It is not the sharp, immediate grief of losing a loved one. It is the slow, grinding grief of watching everything you valued slowly disappear, knowing that you are among the last beings in the universe who even remember that these things existed. The ancient custodian becomes a walking archive of lost possibilities, lost variations, lost potential that humanity will never reclaim. The relationship between ancient custodians and the concept of brotherhood deserves special attention because it reveals one of the most tragic aspects of their existence. As we discussed earlier, custodians are explicitly created not to form the bonds of brotherhood that characterize Space Marine chapters. They are individual warriors, each a self-contained unit, not dependent on others for psychological support or tactical coordination. This individualistic nature is coded into them at the genetic and psychological level. But humans are social creatures, even enhanced humans, even humans who have been genetically programmed for independence. The need for connection, for relationships, for bonds with others, is fundamental to consciousness itself. And the custodians, despite their programming, are not immune to this need. They simply lack the capacity to fulfill it in any meaningful way. An ancient custodian has stood watch alongside thousands of other custodians across the millennia. They have fought beside them, served with them, shared the same duty and the same burden. But they have never truly connected with any of them in the way that Space Marines connect with their battle brothers. The concept of brotherhood is alien to them, not because they lack the capacity for such connection, but because that capacity was deliberately removed or suppressed during their creation. This absence of brotherhood creates a hollow space at the center of the custodian's existence. They are surrounded by others like themselves, others who share their duty and their burden, but they are fundamentally alone in ways that are difficult to articulate. They cannot share their experiences meaningfully, because sharing requires a kind of emotional vulnerability that custodians are not built to express. They cannot seek comfort or support from their peers, because the framework for such interactions simply does not exist in their psychology. For ancient custodians who have existed in this state of enforced solitude for millennia, the psychological damage is profound, even if they cannot recognize it as such. They have been alone for so long that they can no longer even imagine what connection with another being might feel like. The hollow space where brotherhood should exist has become so familiar that it feels normal, natural, the way things are supposed to be. But it is not natural. It is a wound that never heals because it was inflicted during their creation and maintained throughout their existence. Some of the most ancient custodians, the ones who have existed since the Unification Wars, remember the Thunder Warriors. These were the Emperor's first super soldiers, created before the technology for making Space Marines had been perfected. The Thunder Warriors were brutal, unstable, prone to violence and genetic degradation. But they formed bonds with each other, genuine connections forged in blood and battle. And the Emperor eventually destroyed them all, because they were too unstable to be allowed to continue existing. The ancient custodians watched the Thunder Warriors' extermination at Mount Ararat. They participated in it, following the Emperor's orders to eliminate these obsolete warriors who had served their purpose. And perhaps, in some deep recess of their consciousness, the custodians understood that the bonds the Thunder Warriors shared were seen by the Emperor as a weakness to be eliminated rather than a strength to be cultivated. The custodians were designed not to form such bonds, not to be vulnerable through attachment to others. But was this really an improvement? The Thunder Warriors may have been unstable, but they had something the custodians lack: the capacity for genuine connection with their fellow warriors. They were individuals, yes, but they were also part of a brotherhood that gave their existence meaning beyond mere duties. The custodians have duty, have service, have purpose, but they do not have the connections that make consciousness rich and meaningful. And after 10,000 years of this enforced isolation, the ancient ones have become so hollow that they might not even recognize what they are missing. The implications of custodian longevity for the future of the Imperium are worth considering as well. These ancient warriors represent living connections to the Imperium's founding, repositories of knowledge and experience that cannot be replicated or replaced. When the last custodian who remembers the Emperor as he was finally falls in battle or disappears like Valdor, humanity will lose something irreplaceable. The direct link to the Imperium's origins will be severed, and everything that follows will be interpretation and legend rather than remembered truth. This creates a tremendous pressure on the ancient custodians to somehow preserve their knowledge and pass it on. But how do you pass on the totality of 10,000 years of experience? How do you compress millennia of accumulated wisdom into forms that shorter-lived beings can comprehend and use? The task is impossible, and the ancient custodians know it. They can share tactical knowledge, strategic insights, historical facts. But the deeper understanding, the wisdom that comes from witnessing the full scope of the Imperium's rise and fall, the perspective that only extreme longevity can provide. This cannot be transferred or taught. So the ancient custodians carry this burden alone, knowing that when they finally fall, everything they have learned and understood will be lost. They are walking libraries of irreplaceable knowledge, but libraries that will burn when their bodies are finally destroyed. This knowledge of inevitable loss adds another dimension to their existence, another weight pressing down on consciousness that is already staggering under burdens almost beyond endurance. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what happens when a custodian lives too long is that there is no endpoint, no natural conclusion to this process. A human life has an arc: birth, growth, maturity, decline, death. Even space marines, despite their extended lifespans, follow this pattern eventually. But custodians who do not fall in battle simply continue existing indefinitely. There is no decline to signal approaching end, no natural process that will eventually grant them release. They will exist until violence claims them, and given their skill and the fact that most of them never leave Terra, that violence might never come. This means that the psychological erosion we have described will simply continue, compounding and intensifying across not just millennia, but potentially tens of thousands of years or more. A custodian who has already existed for 10,000 years might exist for another 10,000. And then another, and then another. The process of becoming less human, less individual, less conscious in any meaningful sense will continue until what remains is something that can barely be described as a person at all. We might ask whether there is a point at which a custodian's consciousness simply ceases to function, not through physical death, but through a kind of psychological heat death, where the accumulated weight of existence finally overwhelms even their enhanced minds. Perhaps the disappearances of ancient captain generals represent exactly this: beings who reach the absolute limits of how much consciousness can endure before it must either transform completely or simply stop functioning. Or perhaps the transformation is the point. Perhaps the Emperor, in his unknowable wisdom, intended for the custodians to eventually transcend their original purpose, to become something beyond individual warriors. Perhaps the psychological erosion is not a failure, but a feature, a necessary process that strips away everything superficial until only the purest essence of purpose remains. The ancient custodian becomes not a person, but a living embodiment of duty itself, consciousness reduced to its most fundamental form. But whether transformation or tragedy, whether feature or flaw, the end result is the same. Beings who have ceased to be meaningfully human, who exist in a state of eternal service that has consumed everything that once made them individuals. They are the Adeptus Custodes, the Custodian Guard, the 10,000. And they stand watch over humanity's dying god. These golden automatons in the shells of what were once men, performing a duty that cannot end until either they fall or the Imperium itself finally collapses into the darkness that has been claiming it by degrees for 10,000 years. There is a final dimension to this tragedy that bears mentioning. The custodians are aware of what is happening to them. They possess the cognitive capability to understand their own psychological erosion, to recognize the ways in which millennia of existence are transforming them into something less than they were. This awareness does not grant them the power to prevent or reverse the process, but it ensures that they experience it consciously rather than slipping into it unknowingly. Imagine understanding with perfect clarity that you are losing your humanity, that the person you were is being slowly erased by the passage of time, that you are becoming more function than individual with each passing century, and being completely powerless to stop it. You can observe the process, analyze it, recognize each stage as it occurs, but you cannot halt or reverse the transformation. You are a passenger in your own mind, watching yourself become something you never wanted to be, while your enhanced intellect catalogues every step of the deterioration. This conscious awareness of their own dehumanization might be the cruelest aspect of custodian existence. An unaware being undergoing such transformation would not suffer from it in the same way. But the custodians know what they are losing. They remember what it felt like to have richer emotional experiences, to form connections, to care deeply about specific outcomes, rather than merely calculating optimal responses. They can compare their current state to their former selves and recognize the loss. And this comparison, this awareness of diminishment, adds another layer of suffering to an existence already defined by various forms of torment. Some ancient custodians maintain journals or records, attempting to preserve something of their original personality and perspective before the erosion advances too far. These documents are deeply personal and rarely shared, hidden away in private chambers within the imperial palace. They represent attempts to hold on to identity in the face of forces that work inexorably to dissolve that identity. But as the millennia pass, even these efforts falter. The journals become more sparse, the entries more mechanical and devoid of personality. Eventually, many ancient custodians abandon the practice entirely, recognizing its futility in the face of their ongoing transformation. The Emperor's intentions in creating beings capable of such longevity remain mysterious. Did he foresee what would happen to the custodians across millennia of service? Did he understand the psychological price they would pay for their immortality? Or did he simply focus on creating the perfect guardians without fully considering what perfection would cost them in human terms? These questions cannot be answered, and the custodians themselves oscillate between believing the Emperor knew exactly what would happen and hoping that he could not have foreseen the full extent of their suffering. What we can say with certainty is that the Adeptus Custodes represent one of the most profound tragedies in a universe already saturated with tragedy. They were given the gift of immortality and the curse of consciousness that can perceive its own dissolution. They were created to be perfect and condemned to watch that perfection become a prison. They were designed to serve forever and trapped in a forever that strips away everything that makes existence meaningful. They stand as golden monuments to the principle that some gifts are actually curses in disguise, that immortality, without the possibility of change or growth, is not life, but a kind of beautiful, terrible stasis. If you found this comprehensive examination of the Custodian Guard's tragic immortality insightful, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. The stories of Warhammer 40,000 contain depths of tragedy and horror that reward careful examination, and there are countless more such stories waiting to be explored. Until next time, may the Emperor protect you, though perhaps not in the way the custodians are protected, for their protection has become its own form of damnation.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.